Well, welcome once again. This is the Dr. Digital podcast with your host, the Dr. Digital. The purpose of the show is to be transformative. I introduce busy executive or busy business leaders to trends in business, technology, marketing your message. And this is the show that is a jam-packed podcast to highlight people you should know. Did you know that Israeli startups have a global impact and an outsized role? Israel, a nation of only 9 million, is home to over 85 unicorns, companies valued at over $1 billion. This puts Israel behind only the US and China in terms of unicorns per capita. Israel is an innovation hub and focuses on cutting-edge technology. Startups excel in various fields such as cybersecurity, fintech, AI, and medical technology, contributing significantly to global innovation. The talent pipeline introduces and includes military influence. Israel's mandatory military service provides a unique platform for the development of technical skills and fostering a culture of teamwork and problem solving. During this episode, we'll discuss the changes and hot topics in startups and investing in Israel. Let's navigate these waters to better understand these areas and see how they can work for you. By the end of this episode, I'm going to encourage you to contact my guest, startup and innovator investor, Ezra Gardner. And with that, we want to welcome Ezra to the show. Good morning. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You bet. So we want to hear about all the great things that are going on. But of course, we always like to know a little bit about your background. I understand you actually have contacts with well-known people like Warren Buffett. So, there's things that we'd love to know about your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Ezra Gardner. I'm 47 years old. I'm the co-founder and chief investment officer of Varana Capital, which we founded about 13 years ago. Varana Capital is an Israel-based VC fund with offices in Denver and in Tel Aviv as well. And prior to starting this fund, I ran an alternative asset management business in Tel Aviv. And prior to that, I was in New York for a number of years running large value-based public equity portfolios.
Okay. So I understand you're in Denver currently. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. You're in the
Just got back from Tel Aviv a few days ago.
Wow. So lots of things in the news. So you can tell us a little bit about the situation. I'd love to a little bit more and know about the personal insights that you can share with us.
Yeah, well, the biggest takeaway that I can bring back from my recent mission to Israel is that the country is unbelievably resilient. Many of the companies have anywhere between 5 and 50% of the workforce working in reserve duties right now, but the employees that are there are working 5 to 10 times as hard, and the productivity has actually gone up.
That's amazing. So this is part of the resilience of the people. And I understand this is what's really important about knowing about Israel too. But this goes back to Israel's history, because I understand your grandparents were a part of the war for independence, and something that resilience is just a part of the Israeli character.
Yeah, my grandparents fought in the war for independence. My mom was ninth generation born in Israel. So our family has deep roots there. I'm a dual citizen, Israeli American citizen, and I'm there, every 6 weeks or so, having board meetings, meeting with top government officials and bank officials, which was a big part of our recent mission to figure out how we can bring more investment dollars into Israel during this time when VC funds, for the most part, aren't flying there.
Okay. And, I'm curious about what sort of changes that have taken place when I interview guests, but here it's sort of like, well, it's a change, but it's also a chaotic situation in some way. So what can you tell us about what has happened, especially since October?
Well, at first there was, a big psychological shock. It's difficult to describe the level of brutality that took place. But the people that didn't get drafted for the war understood that they had to be soldiers for the Israeli economy. And I feel the same way myself, that, we are soldiers for the Israeli economy. I've been training for 25 years for this mission that I didn't know I had. And in the aftermath of October 7th, we launched a completely pro bono fund called the Chai 10X Fund, where we're bringing $50 million to Israel. We're charging no fees. Everything will be borne by myself and the firm. And we're going to amplify the impact of that through partnerships with the government, partnerships with the top banks there, and also the Israeli financial institutions that hold a lot of cash in the investment dollars.
And so curious how this works out, because it seems like it's an incredibly impossible situation, because all of a sudden I'm the supervisor and half my workforce is gone that day. So how do you survive? I mean, how does that take place, and how have people adjusted?
It's people have to fill in the gaps. I'll give you one example. We have a company that the CFO is 2 days on, 1 day off rotation for the Air Force, and on his day off, he just works 24 hours a day, getting through all the emails and the financial statements, paying the bills, making sure the customer orders are filled, making sure the suppliers are delivering. There's a new hashtag that came out post October 7th, which is Israeli innovation delivers no matter what. And we've seen it firsthand with our own eyes. It's really true.
And are there areas that you can identify as growth areas? And this is what I find is so amazing. Like it should be shutting down the economy. What you're describing is just the opposite, because people have really filled in the gaps and overdone themselves in some ways. Like working 24 hours is incredible. But are there some areas that you can still point to that say, it's still not only going and struggling, but in fact, we're overcompensating?
Yeah. So, myself and my firm, we primarily focus on hardware. We like heavily patented devices that are selling into large and growing end markets where there's a definable benchmark for the industry, where if you can demonstrably outperform that, you take share. And this is a B2B market, right? All of the big companies in Israel are B2B markets because the sea is so small that if you want to get into the European and US and Asian markets, it's B2B. If you look at your cell phone, if you look at your computer, if you look at a medical device that you're using in the hospital, there's Israel inside of all of those, and they're all growth sectors. So, our companies that are producing semiconductor chips, we are designing them in Israel. They're manufactured overseas, like most semiconductors are, and they're getting shipped all around the world. And the products speak for themselves. They have performance that's better. And so despite the fact that there's a war going on, and despite what geopolitical thoughts may be, your phones are still having Israeli chips put in them. Your medical devices that you should be thankful for are still having, Israeli chips put inside them. And these are growth markets. So as long as, you keep up the resilience, you get the employees that aren't drafted into the office to fill in the gaps. And this is something that the Israeli culture is used to doing. This is the teamwork mentality that comes from the national service that everybody has. It's an amazing place. It's not anything like the United States. If you are on a road in Israel, I'll give you a small example. Sure. And there's a minor car accident. Okay. Instead of everyone standing around and looking at what's happening, immediately people mobilize. They get out. One person puts down cones. The other one redirects traffic. The other one gets the ambulance. There's just a mentality of mobilization to help whenever there's a need.
So it's something like nobody's waiting for somebody else to tell them what to do. They're just pitching in because
they've trained, to get to work where there's a need, to not get in the way where there isn't a need, and to keep things moving.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting thing for so many ways. When I was teaching, I would often bring Israel up as an example because it's the primary and mandatory military service. So I think the mentality is, well, we're not waiting. And it's also interesting because if you look at how societies are organized and military, it's at a lower level. In other words, a lower level person makes decisions and also acts, which means they're not waiting for the boss to show up or the captain or the lieutenant, but it means I'm pitching in because I realize I'm in that situation. I need to do something.
Right. And it is that service mentality. So when you show up to work on October 8th and you're missing, 10 of your top men and women, no one says, what do we do? They just do it.
Yeah. And when you would say, again, thinking of the global situation, if something happened like this in another part of the world, and let's say people will say, I'd like to outsource my work to China, for example. If there was some disruption in the China to US and Europe market, that's going to be devastating. And what you're describing is something is just the opposite, which means this is a great place to invest because despite this incredible situation and war that's going on, what you're describing is this is business as usual.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really, really good point. That, as an investor, we always have to think about risks. That's our job, to try and identify risks. And one of the themes of risk is what happens if there's disruption.
Yeah.
And disruption can come in many different forms, right? It can come from an earthquake in Japan, which we've seen recently. It can come from a war. It can come from an economic crisis. But the thing that's different about Israel is that disruption is less of a risk in Israel. It's counterintuitive. People think, oh, this is a place where it's more prone to disruption, but it's a place that disruption has disruption shock absorbers. And places like the United States and Asia and Europe don't have those same disruption shock absorbers.
Now this is a famous story that my father, when he passed away, my sister and I came up with the same idea. There was a devastating snowstorm, right? And what did my dad do? We had to support his family. So he walked literally 16 miles in the snow because nothing was going. There was no transportation. You couldn't get anywhere. And he walked 16 miles. Now, that's the mentality. And that's really close to what you're describing. Okay, well, there's going to be snowfall. There's going to be war. There's going to be things, this external that you can't control. So the response is, what are you going to do? And that particular day, my dad showed up at work. The boss unlocked the door. He worked for 8 hours and then went home and walked again, 16 miles in the snow.
Yeah.
But what you're describing is that you can't let those disruptions really disrupt the operations of the day.
Right. So I actually turn the disruption risk on its head, and I say, not what are the chances of there being a disruption, because there's always a disruption some way, somehow in every part of the world. The question I ask is, what is the responsibility to a disruption? And the responsibility, the response capability to a disruption in Israel is at a factor that's higher than anywhere else you would ever come across. I mean, we see it with our own eyes. I mean, this is a big operation that's going on in Israel now. It was a big shock. I mean, it was something like 80 times as big on a per capita basis as 9/11 was in the United States.
No question. Yeah.
And, I was in New York during 9/11 in the United States, and the city was shut down almost entirely for 3 weeks, like literally almost entirely for 3 weeks. There was no trucks getting in, the grocery store, shelves were empty. Israel wasn't shut down for a day with 80 times the disruption.
And it's amazing, but I think it's also part of what you're saying, the character. But I look at background in history. So I'm in history is 1948, 1966, 1973, ongoing disruptions in the meantime, and now today since October. But that doesn't change anything. That just means the mentality and the character of the people means that we are going to respond because we're sort of accustomed to having all of these external disruptions.
And because we've all been trained in our service on how to respond and how to work together as a team and how to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, and again, the contrast that you're making, I mean, think of during the pandemic, how things were completely disrupted. And this was a relatively and comparatively, even though it was very destructive, comparatively was not the shock that what experienced in Israel. So you could see how everything really just shut down. I mean, I was in the Silicon Valley at the time, and just like what you're describing on 9/11, I mean, nothing moved. Like no one went anywhere. Nothing was delivered.
For almost a month after October 7th, all of the schools were closed because a lot of the teachers were drafted, and There were some security protocols that had to be followed.
Okay.
And what we saw a communal effort to do that. Families moved into each other's houses together because one of them was missing the mother, one of them was missing the father,
Yes.
one of them was missing the school teacher. So they combined families. They created communal living where they filled in all the gaps for the cooking, the chores, the teaching the kids lessons. I mean, it trickled down, not from just the military responsiveness, not just the business responsiveness, but actual the communal living responsiveness as well.
And I think this is part of the Israeli mentality too, correct? I mean, because it's always had so much of a community feel anyway, because there were kibbutzes and there were something where you look at things in a communal sense in the first place.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, and it was there were some heartwarming things to see, coming from there. My aunt had 3 families living in her apartment. They had 4 dogs. They had 6 kids. They had the grandparents moved in, and there was a rotation. Some of the younger parents, I think they had 4 or 5 babies. Some of the younger parents were in service. So my aunt got to change a lot of diapers again, and like everyone chipped in.
And this is somehow an interweaving of families and service, because I understand it that a lot of units in the military, it's not unusual to have family members together, right? You have a father and son perhaps in the unit. So, I mean, they're accustomed to working together and pitching in order to get the mission accomplished.
Yeah, there's all sorts of combinations. And something that you touched on earlier, which I think is
Right.
important to mention, is that there are a lot of units in the Israeli army that are very technology focused, cyber and computer focused. And these are folks now that are some of our top engineers and entrepreneurs in the Israeli tech ecosystem. And so it's not just what they've learned about how to do teamwork, it's also what they've actually practically learned to do from a technology perspective in their service. And we work with many of my CEOs, CTOs in our portfolio companies come from these top units people have heard of, 8200, 8100, that are really, you don't just learn teamwork, you learn real science.
Yeah, and I think this is really important to point out, and that's the transition. Let's say the average ordinary kid in the United States, what's their first job? Like myself, I worked at a drive-in dairy, right? So I'm a clerk or I'm doing something which is service-based, but it's certainly not really preparing me for the reality of the world. And so what you're saying is that there's a military pipeline and a service orientation, so that if I was a young person, right? If a person goes into national service in Israel, they're 18, 19 years old, and they're learning things like cybersecurity and military intelligence, all the kinds of things that are really real world skills that are a great transition to a company or some corporation.
Yeah, you serve in one of these elite computer or cyber units.
Mm.
You come out with an advanced master's degree in computer science, electronics, cyber, and with real world experience that you had, in the field, and you can apply those to the private sector immediately.
Right. And so for people thinking of hiring and looking for the talent, this is what I try to point out too. Israel is a talent hub, right? So you're getting people who have the great mentality and the work mentality, the service mentality, plus the added bonus is they have all these skills that they've actually used for some years before they enter your work.
It's very interesting, actually. When I came back to the States about 13, 14 years ago, I left in Israel, where the large technology companies, like the Apples and the Intels of the world, of course, they had offices there and employees there, but often they were taking their Israeli engineers and they were bringing them to California or Texas or New York. And today, that's actually turned around. Now, Apple and Intel and Samsung and Texas Instruments and all these companies, they're sending their US and Asian and European employees to Israeli offices,
Okay.
to get for the cross pollination that they can receive there from the Israeli engineers.
Would you recommend when it comes to business leaders and CEOs, what kinds of things would you recommend for them to think of? And this is kind of like the talent that you're saying. We've accustomed to talking about things like the brain drain, right? So if things are not going well in a country, people leave. But what you're describing is just the opposite of the brain drain. It's actually the attraction. And this has to do with how companies are run, where they should be looking for the next good employee or the next good skill person.
Yeah, I mean, you should look globally, obviously. And, Tel Aviv in many ways is becoming a very cosmopolitan city now, very
Mm,
much like a Singapore, for example, where the greatest talent in technology is coming from all over the world. And I always encourage my Israeli CEOs to think globally like that too. You don't just need to hire engineers in Israel, although there's amazing ones there. You can look outside. We actually just engaged one of my portfolio companies, an executive search firm based in California, to find us some top engineering talent there. We're looking everywhere. It's a big world.
yeah, and I think what you're saying too is that since there's a global talent base, where are the best places? And I think this is where a lot of companies would see, you don't necessarily have to hire locally, but you're seeing where the innovation hubs are. And if Tel Aviv is really emerging or is a place to look, this is what I would encourage business owners to say. I think this is what you're suggesting as well. Look to Israel and look specifically to, say, a place like Tel Aviv where you're going to find a strong talent base.
Yeah, I mean, if you look across Europe in the major cities, there's a big similarity to the US where the top students go to the top universities to focus on financial careers.
Yeah.
And in Tel Aviv is the only city you'll find in Europe where no one of the top students go to study financial services and financial careers. They all go into technology. The only other city that I can think is even comparable to that would be the Bay Area, would be San Francisco, where you've got a Stanford that's training people for that, and you've got that mindset. But certainly not New York or Chicago or Dallas or London or Paris or any place like that. Tel Aviv is really that spot between San Francisco and Europe, that is the top talent, the top students, go to the top universities to study technology.
Is there a connection between the universities and colleges in Tel Aviv or in Israel that are similar? Because, like, say, Silicon Valley kind of got off its ground and still does with Berkeley and Stanford and the universities there. What's the connection between the educational system and the talent base?
Yeah, there's a university in Tel Aviv in Israel called the Technion, which is some sort of a love child between MIT and Stanford, and it is specifically geared towards technology and the business around technology. And they have cross pollination as well with Stanford, with MIT, with Caltech, and a lot of global professors come there. There's a lot of really interesting research that's going on, and we also see a lot of companies come out of the research institutions. We actually have one portfolio company where the professor and his doctoral student, who are at Hebrew University, designed a patent for a much lower cost manufacturing of a certain type of semiconductor chip. And they went to the university and they said, hey, can we go start a company with this? And they gave the university, I forget if it was like 25% of the equity of the company. And they came out and they started a company, and it's become a very successful company. So there's also, this collaboration between the public and private sector, the academic and private sector, the military and private sector. There's all of these different connections being drawn between these different elements of society that actually create this super ecosystem. It's like you said, the third most companies listed on the NASDAQ after the United States and China is Israel, which is a teeny tiny country compared to those two.
Yeah, I'll say. I mean, it's unbelievable how much. I mean, I'd say if I'm going to push the limit a little bit, I'm going to say it's miraculous, because the question that I would always ask is my historical thinking here: how is it that such a small country, not even relatively, but absolutely in terms of workforce is extraordinarily small, and yet can compete with the two biggest countries, and with a very large population. It indicates that with an incredibly small population, how that's much better and much more prepared based on its side in compared to the largest countries in the world.
Yeah, there's a saying that I'll probably get a little bit wrong, but adversity is the mother of invention, or something
Mm.
like that. For example, there's a big agri-tech sector which we invest heavily in Israel, and this agri-tech sector brings its roots back to to even pre-war for independence, where basically you had a very arid land where you
Yes.
didn't have a lot of water, and you also didn't have a lot of external food supply. You didn't have a lot of trading partners. So you had no ability to import food. You didn't have a lot of water, but you needed a lot of food. So you developed you used technology to figure it out with drip irrigation, which Israel invented, with, different greenhouses and all sorts of ways to get more yield, out of the earth. And in many ways, when you look at the inventions especially in the hardware space that Israel has made, they all basically do one of two things. They figure out ways to use less water, or figure out ways to use less power, less electricity, because these were things that Israel didn't have. Israel doesn't have any oil. Israel doesn't have any water. And if you fast forward to today and you think about what are the two most scarce resources that the world has to figure out how to solve, the answer is figure out how to use less water and figure out how to use less energy. And that's why these inventions, whether people know it or not, these innovations are actually doing amazing things for the world. And so, I wrote an open letter on LinkedIn, which you guys can find if you look me up in the days after October 7th. And I said, these are very difficult times. And what should we pray for in very difficult times? I said, let's pray for Israeli innovation to continue, because we all use it and we all need it.
Certainly it's a biblical idea. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, right? So, I mean, this is something that the world needs to hear. And I think, if you were trying to tell us what were some of the leading areas, and I think this is one of them, because you really keep a key point. There's this buzz phrase now, we talk about sustainability, right? Now, that's kind of a new word that's kind of been bandied about. But what you're saying is that, let's say even pre-war for independence, sustainability was something that was the mentality in Israel anyway, right? So, I
Yeah,
mean, they've really been working on this for, like 70 years.
we have a head start. Yeah. Or 80 years almost. Yeah.
Yeah, I
We have
almost
a head
say,
start.
yeah. So, really, I mean, this is something that should focus people, because that's an excellent point of saying, what are people trying to do now? Well, they're trying to be sustainable, but this is something that Israeli technology has been working on for a long time, both in terms of energy and water. And these are some key resources. If we don't have those things, you don't have energy, you don't have water, your nation will cease to exist. Population can't survive.
Yeah, and it comes from the coolest things, right? There's an Israeli company developing solar panels that also take moisture out of the air to gather water, fresh water, in areas that don't have a lot of fresh water sources. The thing that Israel does really well is they just think outside the box, and I know that that's a catchphrase, but it's really true. You take engineers and scientists that were never trained to do things in a specific way and give them a blank piece of paper, and it's amazing what they can come up with.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You made a reference to LinkedIn. Yes, I saw one of the videos where it says exactly that point, that nobody has come in and said, okay, we're going to go for a 4-year engineering degree and now we're going to apply themselves. They just throw these young people in and it's a blank slate. So although they're thinking outside the box, it's like they don't even know what the box is, which
Right,
means
right,
they're
right.
really.
And if you told them, if they knew anything about the specific subject matter about how to make an electric motor or how to make a solar panel, they may convince themselves not to try this crazy idea, because all of the standard university learnings are that this is how you make a motor, this is how you make a solar panel. But when you're freed from the constraints, it's amazing the things that you come up with. It's human
Yeah,
ingenuity.
it's I always say there's a way of thinking about things to solve social problems. And they say, well, we don't have enough energy, so let's not use as much energy. And then they try to convince people not to use energy. But that's really counterintuitive to Homo sapiens as a species. I mean, who was the guy who invented fire, right? I mean, who was the guy who invented the wheel? I mean, all of these things came from complete innovation. So when you approach a problem, look at it fresh. Okay, we've got to get the cart from A to B. What's the easiest way to transport it? So somebody comes up, well, let's use a wheel, right? Well, there is no wheel because no one engineered it first. It's innovation is the key.
Yeah, if you remember during or if you've read about during the oil crisis in '73, the president of the United States was encouraging everyone to put on sweaters. That was the solution. Just turn off the thermostat and put on sweaters, right?
Yeah.
And in many ways, Europe is doing that right now with their energy crisis. Don't use air conditioning, don't use heating. What Israel is doing is they saying, well, you know what's consuming all of this electricity are these data centers, okay? And the data centers are so power hungry. What if we could design a chip for a data center that uses 1/10 the energy of the current paradigm? Then all of a sudden we've freed up all this free energy.
Yeah. It's that hits close to home. My first car was actually in 1973.
So
All of
you
a
were
sudden,
lining up in the gas station lines, huh?
was lining up or I wasn't going anywhere because we
Yeah.
couldn't get gas. And that too ties in with Israel because we were being punished at that time. But you're right. The president came out and said it was probably one of those things that led to his defeat in the next election because it seemed very un American to just say, put on a sweater. No, we're supposed to come up with a solution to the problem and not discourage people from living a life that is as fully human as possible to use the things that they need and also to do what they need. I'm really curious on how this goes and how this has worked out. And you really touch close to home because I got my first car and all of a sudden it was a gas crisis. And it was not a satisfying answer because it's one thing that we don't want to hear is it's kind of like your parents telling you, you can't do this and you can't go there and you got to. So that sort of mentality is not something which is, I think, inherent in human beings. We want to be able to live as
It's
freely
defeatist.
as
It's
possible.
defeatist.
That's
Come up
defeat.
with come up with better solutions. Don't stop doing what you need to do. And the world, like I said, the world needs these solutions, and that's why we are continuing to invest in Israel. We're doubling down on Israel. It's a great time to invest in Israel. I encourage everyone who's interested in investing in Israel to reach out to me and to talk about investing or talk about how you can help or just with more questions or learning more about what the Israeli tech ecosystem is, because it's a magical thing.
That's a really important point I wanted to make sure we address as we start to close down the interview. But what would you recommend business leaders and CEOs to be thinking about, and how can you help them?
You mean the one specifically in Israel?
Yeah, and what you're doing currently, and
Yeah,
what would
yeah.
you suggest that they do?
Yeah, I think that they're doing a lot of the right things, right? First of all, they're keeping their team organized and heading in the right direction. However, all research and development companies need money. It's the oxygen. So I encourage them to reach out to me. I'm working on many different solutions to amplify the money that we're raising for the pro bono Chai 10X fund by multiples. I've already had this morning before our call 4 calls with Israeli CEOs going through various ways to interact and collaborate with the banks, the financial institutions there, government, and I encourage them to reach out to me if you haven't already, because this is a huge focus of ours. When we go back in a few weeks' time, we're going to be meeting with a large body in the Knesset, the Congress, the Parliament there, to come up with some ideas that we've been working on how to help through this time. It is a crisis time. We know that, but the resilience is there more than ever, and we're going to get through it. And I'm going to be here to help you.
And it's a point that's probably the bottom line. What you're saying is that it's a crisis, but Israel is open for business. So don't
Yes.
dissuade anybody from thinking that things are not going on because they're used to now accomplishing the goals regardless of the situation. So Israel's open for business.
Absolutely.
Now, you said like we'd like people to reach out to you. How do they get a hold of you? And could you give us some contact information? I know on LinkedIn I've seen some things, but what else can people do to reach out?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Again, my name is Ezra, Ezra, last name Gardner, Gardner. And my email address, which I'm happy to give out, are my initials, EMG, Echo Mike Golf, at varanacapital.com, VARANA capital.com. Feel free to email me or message me on LinkedIn. And also on our website, there's a way to get in touch with us, whether you're a company looking for funding, whether you're an investor looking to invest, whether someone like yourself, I think you reached out to us on our website looking to, talk to me, in a formal or informal capacity. We're here to help. We're here for Israel, and we'd love to talk to you. We'd love your support in any way you can give it.
Absolutely. That sounds so exciting and it's great. So thank you very much for your time, Ezra. I really appreciate it. It's very insightful and I think it's really informative for so many people. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for taking some time out today.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
All right. Thank you so much. And this is the Doctor of Digital closing out the show. We'd love people to reach out to you because I think this is a really exciting story. And that's why I wanted to get Ezra on. So if you have any interest, make sure that you reach out to Ezra. Again, I have a lot of guests that are along these lines, always hoping that, of course, you subscribe, you share the podcast, and also like us, especially on Apple Podcasts. That helps keep the show going. So until next time, we'd like to make sure that you're listening. This is the Doctor of Digital signing off. Until next time, Deus Volt.